Hi, Stuart Sutton at Agent Finder. We're going to show you specifically how the type of financing your buyer gets affects your costs at closing when you sell your home. A lot of people have concerns about this. Voice those concerns. I'm going to cover it in this video. Now, I don't know if I've mentioned this on any of my videos, but my parents owned a real estate company when I was growing up. My mom was a very well-known broker and real estate agent in the community we lived in. She was considered a top producer, and she was very successful in the real estate arena. She ran TV commercials in a fairly small market, and those TV commercials really caught people's attention. As a matter of fact, I remember that 25 to 30 years after she'd run her last commercial, people still said, "Oh, you're the lady on those commercials." 25 to 30 years later, they were thinking, "Oh yeah, I just saw that commercial." Well, they hadn't seen it for 25 or 30 years. Why am I telling you this? Well, because people tend to keep things in mind that are memorable, and they think that they just occurred when they haven't. And we're going to talk about that with financing that buyers bring when they buy your home. So there used to be a time when the type of financing that a buyer used could affect your closing costs as a seller. Well, that time has ended for the most part. In other words, there was a time when a buyer had an FHA loan, there were certain costs they weren't allowed to pay, so the seller had to pay them. The same with a VA loan. Now, nowadays, that's just not the case anymore. A conventional loan is typical financing, 30-year mortgage. We see it all the time. Closing costs for the buyer are mostly related to the mortgage. Your closing costs are pretty well standard and fixed. I've actually got another video that shows you what those are, but they're standard and fixed, whether someone comes with a conventional mortgage or they bring you a cash offer. Your closing costs are going to be pretty much the same. I say pretty much the same. They're going to be the same. Now, what about an FHA loan? What about a government loan? When a buyer comes with a government loan, FHA, it's insured. How does that affect your closing costs? Well, it doesn't. Your closing costs will stay about the same. I have had people say, "Well, gosh, it costs me more when someone uses FHA, doesn't it?" Well, that's been a long time, kind of like my mom's commercials. That's been 25 to 30 years ago when FHA actually costs the seller extra closing costs. They opened FHA and VA up to the open market, so those rates fluctuate just like conventional rates fluctuate, and the closing costs are bound to the buyer and are passed to the seller. There is one exception. If a veteran buyer comes along, the veteran buyer is not allowed to pay one closing cost, one expense related to the house sale, and that is the termite inspection. So the extra expense that you would have is the termite inspection if your buyer were a VA buyer. Now, can a veteran buyer ask you to pay closing costs? Yes, of course they can. Can an FHA buyer ask you to pay closing costs? Yes, of course they can. Can a conventional buyer? Yes, of course they can. Even a cash buyer can. There aren't many closing costs related to a cash transaction, but any buyer can ask you as part of the negotiation to pay closing costs. You're not obligated to. The most obvious type of contract and financing where you would be asked to pay closing costs is a VA loan. The reason for that is because the Veterans Administration offers nothing down mortgages to veterans. So to keep their nothing down status, they may ask you to pay their closing costs, so they're literally buying the house for nothing down. If they don't ask you to pay closing costs, they're putting no down payment, and then they're paying their own closing costs. So although they're allowed to ask you to pay closing costs, I don't really see too many VA buyers asking sellers to pay closing costs. And I do have a video that covers exactly that. What happens when a buyer asks you to pay closing costs? How should you handle it? That video is really quite interesting. You might want to watch that one. So the bottom line is, whether the contract is cash, conventional, FHA, VA, your closing costs are virtually the same. Your responsibility as a seller and what you pay is pretty much the same with any type of mortgage financing that the buyer has. The exception being the termite inspection, and that'll vary depending on where you're located. Could be anywhere from $100 to $175. And that's not enough to really even worry about. Now, there are other types of financing out there, and you want to make sure your agent is familiar, and if they're not, that they become familiar with what that financing entails. You might get an offer, for example, for someone that has down payment assistance from a local organization or even a national organization. You just want to make sure that if your agent is familiar with it already, that they do their homework and become familiar with it so you know exactly how it affects you. I hope that makes sense. So as I said, I did put another video up here. This is about buyers asking you to pay closing costs, how it affects your contract, and how you might want to handle it. If you like this video, press that like button. I hope you'll subscribe and watch more videos. And remember, it's your choice. Make it a powerful day.